As we all know, and perhaps many of us sadly know from experience, sin has its consequences. Consequences in the way that it affects us, but also in how it affects other people. A very simple but dramatic illustration that you may know in these days is when someone has an affair and that ends up meaning the marriage end in divorce. That is only the beginning of the effects that it has on people and the wider people within that family relationship. Think of the damage done to the children in such occasions. But the greatest effect of sin, the greatest damage that sin has upon anyone, is its effect on our relationship with the Lord. So how does sin do that? In what way does it affect our relationship with the Lord? Well, that's what we're going to look at today. Because basically the key point in this is the key effect of sin is it breaks fellowship with Him. Meaning, therefore, when we sin, we need to deal with it, and we need to deal with it in order that we can get back into fellowship with God. But is that all that happens? What else happens? Well, quite a long list of things, actually. And I think there's a story here that illustrates some of the things that can happen, that vividly demonstrate, in fact, for us, some of the impacts when our relationship with the Lord is damaged because we step out of line in this way. And that story is revealed to us here in Exodus chapter 33. Now, in order to understand Exodus 33, you need to understand where we've come from and just think about what we've been together through Exodus 32. And you'll recall we've had this famous, infamous story of the worshipping of the golden calf. So you'll remember while Moses was on top of Mount Sinai communing with the Lord, he'd actually been gone for 40 days, and while he was gone, the children of Israel got Aaron, and they persuaded him to build them a golden calf, and then they worshipped the golden calf, and things descended from worship into debauchery, and that's the background of what is going to happen next. So in chapter 32, we had the worship of the golden calf. Now in chapter 33, we're going to hear the result of what that meant. So let's start with verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, you and your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your descendants I will give it, and I will send my angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites and the Amorites, the Hittites and the Perizzites, and the Hivites and the Jebusite. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go up in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." Okay, can you see what's changed here? Now keep in mind the children of Israel have just sinned in this terrible way. So the Lord now comes to Moses and says, I'm going to facilitate you getting to the promised land. Now, at one point in chapter 32, he said he was going to do that. In fact, prior to this, he had just said, in fact, if you go way back, that he'd promised to be with them into the promised land. Then following this, it had got to the point, it had degraded to the point where he said, I'm not even going to deal with these people anymore. He actually said to Moses, step aside and I'll wipe them out, and let's start all over again. But you'll remember Moses interceded and the Lord relented and he said, okay, I won't do that. So now he comes back to, if you like here, an answer to the intercessory prayer of Moses in chapter 32, where he says, okay, I'll take you to the land, but I'm not going to go with you and be in the midst of you anymore. So in a sense, we've got a revision to the plan now. The original plan was God said he was going to be in the midst of his people in that tabernacle that he was built. He was going to be right there in the middle of them all the time, every day. But now he's actually saying, I'm not even going to accompany you, this sinful group of people, on this journey to Canaan. He had originally intended to be with them in the tabernacle, but now he says, I'm not going to be with you. Instead, he's going to send, verse 2 said he's going to send my angel before you. So before we look at the difference of what that means here, one of the questions we need to ask when we look at this passage is, who is this, what is described as my angel? Now, the version I've read for you today is from the New King James Bible. And in my Bible, it says they've got the "my" of angel capitalized, and it's in italics, and they've got the word angel capitalized as well. So what does it mean when it's in italics and it says my angel? So there are several observations to be made here. One is, it's obviously not the Lord himself. He just said, I'm not going with you. It's my angels going with you. So many would say that this is a general angel, not the Lord. The option then being that it is a created one of the Lord's created angels, his servant. Now there are some people who will point out, and it certainly does appear in the Old Testament, that you have the term angel of the Lord used to refer to the pre-incarnate Christ. And that is certainly true in some passages. I do believe that's the case, but I also believe that that is not the case here. Now it's a little tricky to try and figure this out, but what you have to do is look at each passage in each case, and by doing that and looking at this one in isolation and the slightly different use of the words that have been selected here and translated as my angel, I tend to think that this is not the angel of the Lord, not the pre-incarnate Christ, because he'd literally just said, well, I'm not going with you personally myself. But let me be clear, I'm not saying the pre-incarnate Christ does not appear in angelic form in the Old Testament. I'm just saying that I don't think that's what's happening here. You see, this passage is about the ongoing consequences of their sin and the breaking of the commandments given to them, and the consequences arising out of that being, one of the big consequences is that the Lord is not now going to be in the midst of them. He's replacing that plan with a plan with just how to have his angels leading the people. So the response to this is then seen in verse 4. And when the people heard this bad news, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. So you can see that they obviously themselves recognize that this is a lower level of God's involvement with them. So interesting to me is the fact, yes, that it appears they did get the message from the Lord, and they were aggrieved and upset about this. He's not going to go with us now. He's not going to be with us in our journey. So clearly, in the announcement here, in the opening of chapter 33 of Exodus, there is a change of God's relationship to the children of Israel. And the consequences of their sin is the loss of the blessing that leads people to a situation where they mourn and be sorrowful of the breakdown in their relationship and indeed their ongoing daily fellowship with the Lord that had previously been promised. And that is clearly one of the consequences of their sin, and that is clearly one of the consequences, I still believe, of our sin, in terms of a change in the relationship of fellowship that we need to have with the Lord. When we fall into sin, serious sin, one of the consequences of that is at some level a loss of fellowship with the Lord and the blessings that would normally go along with that. The text continues in verse 5, For the Lord said to Moses, Say to the children of Israel, You are a stiff-necked people. I could come up into your midst and in one moment and consume you. Now therefore take off your ornaments, that I may know what to do. Now the key for verse 5 is the fact that it is introduced with the word for. Now you've probably heard me say this many times, but when the word for is at the beginning of a sentence, well, in everyday life as well, but particularly in the biblical narrative, it means the writer is at that point going to explain what he's just said or what has just happened. So in this case, verse 5 is an explanation of verse 4, the order of which is a bit confusing, but clearly the people are removing their jewelry in response to what the Lord said and commanded of them. So this is something that the Lord said previously, and this is the people's reaction in verse 4. So to put it in chronological order, if you wish, then it's saying the Lord says, I know I could come down in the midst of you and consume you for what happened, but take off your ornaments while I decide what to do to you. Show a little humility, which is where we reach this point where the children of Israel are. They've heard the bad news, they're mourning, to the point where I would actually imagine that no one felt like putting on their best garb and their ornament. So verse 5 in a sense is explaining verse 4. Anyway, the narrative continues where it says in verse 6, the children of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments by the mountain of Horeb. Now, remember, by the way, that it was these very ornaments that were used in the rebellion against God, and that had been a great offence to him. So we're talking about rings and necklaces, bracelets, ankles, and all that sort of stuff. The very same stuff, remember, that they used to build the golden calf. So ornaments was part of it, jewelry was part of it. And the Lord is saying here, all that stuff now is offensive to me, so take it off. And there's good reason to believe that they never wore it again. Later in the book, we will see they will use some of this stuff that was probably gathered in and collected and held in one place to build the tabernacle. But the point is, at this point, the Lord is disgusted with them and their sin, and he's threatening not to be with them when they go into the land of Canaan. And this is what he demands of them. So the first part of this passage is we see they've lost their fellowship with the Lord because of what they've done. And now what happens next visibly illustrates for us what's going on. Exodus 33, 7-10 tells us, Moses took his tent and pitched it outside the camp, far away from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of meeting. Remember, the word tabernacle just means tent. And it came to pass that everyone who sought the Lord went out to the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. So it was whenever Moses went out to the tabernacle that all the people rose, and each man stood at his tent's door and watched Moses until he had gone into the tent. And it came to pass, when Moses entered the tabernacle, the tent of the Lord, that a pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle. And the Lord talked with Moses. And all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the tent door, and all the people rose up and worshipped, each man and woman at his tent door. What you need to notice here, some things are important. Moses took his tent, and he now calls it the tent, the tabernacle of meeting. Now remember, the word tabernacle just means tents. So this is not this large building and the surrounding area that was given to Moses as instructions for his construction earlier in the book. That will in fact be built later in the book. This is Moses' own personal tent. The tabernacle, the full tabernacle, has not been built yet. But what it's saying is anybody who wants to have direction from the Lord now has to go outside the camp towards Moses' tent, where he is communing with the Lord. So what this is drawing attention to the fact is, by their actions now the whole camp, and remember this is a huge camped area of potentially up to 2 million people, what it's saying is that whole area, that whole place that holds the nation of Israel has now been defiled by the sin of the people. So the tent of meeting, the place where God can come and meet with Moses as their mediator, is now got to be placed geographically outside that area. So when the people want to seek the Lord for spiritual guidance, they have to exit the main tented area, the camped area where they're currently living, and they've got to go and situate and visit a situation outside the main area. And this tabernacle of meeting is the place where Moses would place his tent, and when he went there to that and went in it, a pillar of cloud would descend and stood over the door of Moses' tent, indicating very clearly God's presence. So the Lord would talk with Moses there, but the people had to stay outside at a distance from the entrance to the tent. They now could only worship God from a distance, and they could only do it by coming from outside their camp and approaching the area that God had now set aside for that. So here we are, the people are left watching Moses have fellowship with the Lord from a distance, indicating very clearly for us that at this point, well, things have changed dramatically. The people have a very strange and strained relationship with the Lord their God. And verse 11 tells us, the Lord then spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. And then he would return to their camp, but his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle. This is a vivid picture, isn't it? I mean, talk about sinning and losing your fellowship with the Lord. I think this paints it in graphic detail for us. So the Lord is meeting in a tent over there, outside the camp, away from the people. Moses goes in and has fellowship with the Lord face to face, but the people are separate now. And it tells us that the Lord spoke to Moses face for face as a man would speak to his friends. So clearly this term face to face is figurative language. What is drawing attention to the fact here, this is real, simple intimacy, like between two friends, uninhibited communication with the Lord, available to Moses, openness, friendship. We are called to mind to imagine a meeting with your best friend, someone that you can share all your personal troubles with. Meet without fear. This is the kind of intimate, unbroken openness and friendship that is available to Moses here with God. But the people themselves, they are kept back. They are kept standing far off whilst Moses is engaged in this personal relationship with the Lord. The contrast is stark, isn't it? So very quickly, what we've got so far is two things. We've got God saying to the children of Israel, they've got to stay in their own area and outside this area of this camp, this tent of meeting, in contrast to Moses, who is himself exits the main camp and has his tent of meeting with the Lord, the place where he can have a close, intimate fellowship with him. So far, then, what we can absolutely conclude from this opening part of chapter 33 is that sin breaks your fellowship, damages, changes your relationship with the Lord. But do also note that God has not completely abandoned that rebellious nation. He's not abandoned them completely, but on the other hand, it certainly means that they're losing fellowship with him. It means that they've lost that intimate, personal, face-to-face and open, close relationship with the Lord. So there's one more section in this chapter, and that begins in verse 12, where we're going to be given a glimpse into the fellowship that Moses has with the Lord. And Moses asks 3 questions of the Lord, and he answers them. And we'll observe what is happening between the Lord of Moses in the tent of meeting over the following verses. Beginning in verses 12, it says, Then Moses said to the Lord, See, you say to me, Bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found grace in my sight. Now therefore I pray, I have found grace in your sight. Show me now your way, that I may know you, and that I may find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people. Now we caught a glimpse earlier of Moses praying back in the last chapter 32, and here he is praying, interceding once again. Now all of this happens after the announcement of God that he would not go with them now into the promised land. Instead, God has placed himself outside the main body of people as a symbolic gesture of illustrating of the distance that now exists between him and people. And this provokes the questions that Moses is asking here. What Moses is essentially saying with this first question is, who is going with us? He reminds the Lord, he knows that the Lord's going to lead him or provide the angel to lead them, but he reminds the Lord that he is the one that God says has found grace in his sight. Therefore Moses requests that that grace is expressed. And one way it can be expressed is the Lord showing him who will be going with them. And at the same time, Moses reminds the Lord, if you like, that these are the Lord's people after all. And that's the case he argued back in the last chapter. You see, the withdrawal of God's presence from Israel has created a problem for Moses as Israel's mediator. Moses is reminding God that he's in a covenant relationship with Israel, and he's asked Moses to lead the nation, and Moses is wanting to know who is leading and who is going to lead the nation with him. In a sense, some would say he's really asking for reassurance that God himself will still be in some way involved in leading the nation of Israel, spiritually leading the nation of Israel into the wilderness. The Lord commands Moses and assures him that he knows Moses, that it's him who is in that leadership role, and using this analogy of knowing him by name, indicating that Moses belongs to him. So again, Moses is interceding on behalf of the nation by reminding the Lord that these were his people. That's how he declared them. And in verse 14, the Lord responds by saying, and he says, My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. So this is a big step forward from the previous statement God made in chapter 32, when he was effectively telling Moses to stand aside and declaring that he would lead him out, but he would start all over again with just Moses. Moses is pleaded with the Lord, interceding for the nation of Israel, and the Lord changed his mind, and he's now stating that he will go with them, but in this new way. And Moses here is reminding the Lord of their relationship, emphasizing that he wants to know his way and to experience his grace, thereby knowing that he can lead the people, and that by doing so, the people need not experience destruction or even the righteous justice of God to fall on them for their sinful acts in the previous chapter, but yet God might instead express his grace. Moses' second question follows in verse 15 when he says, "If your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here. For how then will it be known that your people and I have found grace in your sight, except you go with us? So shall we be separate, your people and I, from all the people who are upon the face of the earth." So Moses is telling the Lord here, reminding them that he should go with them still. He should be with them still, because if he does not do that and they're taken from this place, then history will not testify to the fact that the people found grace in the Lord's sight, and that he is a forgiving God, and that he still, in some way, went with them and led them, albeit differently this time. So Moses is again appealing to God's reputation, just as he did in the previous chapter. He's acknowledging the sin of the people, but he's requesting mercy. And he's saying he wants God to express that mercy, not just for the benefit of the people, because he wants the world to witness God's grace towards the nation of Israel. By going with them and displaying his grace through their journey and demonstrating that God would protect them, especially as they continue towards the promised land, by doing this, Moses is insisting nothing less than the world would witness this, and one might assume would respond to it in some way. And the Lord responds to Moses' request by saying in verse 17, "So the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing that you have spoken, for you have found grace in my sight, and I know you by name." That's you, Moses. So here God agrees to Moses' request, and he does that because of their continued, ongoing, established personal relationship. We see similarly in the book of Genesis that Abraham was also called the friend of God, which is in fact James in the New Testament highlights this fact for us. So Moses here is invoking this type of relationship, the one where God calls people by the name. Even the Lord himself in the New Testament acknowledged and affirmed for the fact that the Lord knew Moses by name. All of it indicating the sort of close, intimate relationship, a friendship it's described as. And because of that friendship, that closeness of relationship, we see God grant Moses' request. Let's move on to the third question Moses asks of God in verse 18. And he says, "Lord, please show me your glory." Then he said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you." This is God now speaking. "And I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live." And the Lord said, "Here is a place by me, and you shall stand on a rock. So it shall be that while my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand while I pass by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." This is a strange passage here, but it's talking about the impossibility, the implausibility of any person, even a chosen friend of God, to stand within the very presence of God in his full glory. A few verses earlier, Moses has just expressed his desire to know God and know him in this intimate personal way, and now he's explicitly asked to see God's glory in full. And in response, God tells him, "I will make my glory be seen," in the sense I will pass before you, but the main way I will make my glory seen for the wider world is the fact I will proclaim the name of the Lord through you and the people. But Moses still presses, and he says he wants to see his face directly, and God says, well, no one can do that. No one can see him, be exposed to his holiness, his full glory, and live. So the Lord then instead instructs Moses to stand in the cleft of a rock, whilst in his full glory he passes by. He will place Moses in this crack, this gap in a rock, and using figurative language, he will cover him with his hand, thus ensuring that Moses won't die from this experience, but at the same time passing him by in this way. This is a picture of the Lord granting Moses a greater revelation of himself than any man had ever had before, albeit still limited. And all this is, of course, remembers going on while the children of Israel are way stood back at the camp, and Moses in this way experiences this amazing intimate encounter with God, not seen anything close to it in Scripture before or since. So to summarize all that's been going on here, what we have seen is that due to their sin, the children of Israel have lost their intimate friendship with the Lord, their intimate fellowship with the Lord, and that the fact that the God has withdrawn in a sense, and he's no longer going to go with his original plan to live absolutely in their midst. However, Moses has not participated in this sin, and he, as the one person, is the one who has been able to maintain his intimate relationship with the Lord. But in the midst of this passage, did you notice, by saying these things, he says to Moses, I will give you rest, which means that he will give him peace. He will find a place in peace in the knowledge of this intimate relationship with him. And in the closing part of this passage, it talks about God actually passing by. And we know from that God revealed himself to Moses more intimately than anyone ever had, and through that process God did indeed learn much about the Lord. So the takeaway we can take from that is Moses at this point did entreat the Lord to know more about the Lord's way, and for the Lord to reveal more of himself and more intimately to anyone than he had ever done before, and he did that. Now, that's all strange language and symbolic at times, I'm sure, but I think I can close and make a couple of observations and draw an application out of it for us. And the big thing you mustn't miss here, folks, is this passage teaches us all, even today, that sinning causes you to lose your fellowship with him. But it doesn't just end up with the loss of fellowship, it damages your relationship with him. Yes, it hinders your ongoing relationship with him. But it's important to note that the Israelites did not cease to be God's people, but the fellowship with the Lord and the way it was practiced suffered greatly. You see, having fellowship with the Lord means you get the opportunity to talk to him and get the opportunity for him to share who he is and his truth with you, which he does, of course, today mainly through his word. But it seems to me that what's really going on here is that Moses is the one who stands out and says very powerfully all the time, Moses is the one who calls out and says, Lord, I want to know you. I really want to know your ways. I want to be closely involved with you and speak to you every day. And that, of course, should be the ultimate goal for anyone seeking a close fellowship with God. So this passage is not just about the breaking of the fellowship and the consequences that it means. It's drawing attention to the fact that sin causes us to lose the opportunity to learn more about the Lord. Because when you're not walking with him, you don't get to know him and you don't get to know what he's like. When you have sin in your life, you are blocked in that intimate relationship, fellowship with the Lord. But what's the route out of this situation? What's the route back when you've done that? Well, for us today, it's simply we have to confess it to get back into fellowship with him. He's not going to kick us out of the camp. He's just going to move himself away from us. When we fall into sin, as illustrated here in this story, is the fact that we are the ones who lose because he's the one who moves away from us. In other words, you lose the power of God in your life. You lose the power of the influence of the Lord in your life and in the lives of other people that you care about. And that is the big takeaway here, that you lose that opportunity for a more intimate knowledge of the Lord. And I think that's the tragic part of this whole story. Remember previously, earlier in the passage in Exodus, God had promised to be in the middle of his people, in the midst of everything they do. And he said on top of that he was going to be with them wherever they went, in whatever they experienced in life. Whereas now, yes, he's still available to them, but that relationship has changed. They now have the tabernacle going to be travelling with them and placed and built in different locations outside the main camp. But Moses, as the one who stays true and stays in that deep, intimate relationship with God, is the only one who's promised that he's going to know the full peace of God. So what we saw at the beginning of this passage is the people being stripped of all their ornaments and jewellery, and all the trappings are taken away from the people. But it ends with the Lord saying to Moses, I'm going to give you peace and you're going to find a place of rest. So you have two different illustrations of a group of people opposed to one single person. In one camp you have weeping and the stripping away of the things that people valued, the loss of the things that people valued. And over here you have this other place, a place of peace with Moses and an intimate relationship with God. And I think that's a principle that we should recognize and apply in our lives by always trying to spend time coming to him with thanksgiving in our heart, and as it says in the New Testament, letting our requests be known to God, so that the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard our hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. You see, once you have that peace, once you live in that place, camp in that camp, you will not want to lose it. But sin is the thing that can destroy that opportunity. So the bottom line, I believe this passage is teaching, is don't sin for the simple reason that you lose the ability to have a close, intimate relationship with the Lord. You lose the ability to experience the benefits of the power of prayer. And very practically, getting prayers answered, because you will not see God working in your life powerfully if you don't have that intimate knowledge of the Lord, if you don't have that intimate relationship with the Lord because of the sin in your life. And with all of that, it means you won't get the benefit of the peace that comes from that. Whereas the child of God who stays in fellowship with God and simply responds to the call of God to come to me, all of us, all who are heavy laden, in the knowledge that he will give you rest. He will give you peace. So today, the Lord is saying, don't rebel as those children of Israel did. Stay with him in a place of peace. The whole point of this chapter, I believe, is to create a vivid picture that shows us the contrast for God's people, that's you and I still today, friends, against those who rebel and thereby find themselves distanced from God, and those who live in love and obedience and thereby are allowed to always draw nearer and nearer and nearer to him. I certainly know which camp I would prefer to be in. Okay everyone, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And today, as we're reaching the back end of Season 5, where we've been working together through the book of Exodus, we've reached Exodus chapter 34, and we're going to look here at this renewal of the promises of God, the one in which we see God ascribe again, make some new tablets for Moses with the 10 Commandments, and he renews his covenant with the people. And then this amazing, strange section at the end where, after God passing by and revealing himself to Moses, talks about Moses, having a shining face. Okay, and like I said, and like I mentioned in the introduction, it's such a long passage today, it's best you probably follow along. The full passage that we're going to be reading, Exodus chapter 34, verses 1 to 35, is contained within the episode notes page. I'll just begin by drawing attention to the fact that one of the big important spiritual truths revealed in the Bible at this point over these last few episodes we've looked at is the fact that sin breaks people's fellowship with God. It doesn't break our relationship with God, but it breaks the nature of how close and how closely we can approach Him and how intimate our fellowship can be with Him. And this has been dramatically illustrated for us over the last couple of days as we've looked at what has occurred with the children of Israel in the book of Exodus in 32, where they rebelled against God with the golden calf, and in chapter 33, where we see with God withdrawing Himself, in a sense, from being amongst the people and setting up camp effectively outside the main body of people with Moses. And we saw that described in chapter 33. We saw how they committed the sin of adultery, and because of it, they literally lost their fellowship with God. In stark contrast, Moses, he is seen to maintain an intimate fellowship. It's actually described as a friendship with the Lord. But that's not the end of the story, as we'll see today. Chapter 34 reveals us more about what happens next. So the Israelites sinned, they fell into idolatry, and they lost their close, intimate relationship with the Lord. But Moses has remained faithful throughout, and this sets the backdrop for what will be the renewal of the covenant, which is going to be depicted for us here in chapter 34, emphasizing that as grievous as sin is, it will not completely break, in that sense, break off our potential relationship with God. And Exodus 34 is a significant chapter in highlighting that great spiritual truth. Now, recently we've been through a series of very long chapters, so to ensure I'm going to cover the chapter, I'm going to do the usual thing, which is summarize it, do a little bit of an expository walk through it, but instead of reading the chapter, it's best you actually just follow it along, and I'll refer and read out occasional verses as we go, as I explain what I believe has happened as the chapter progresses. So the chapter begins with God instructing Moses to cut 2 new tablets of stone, like the first ones, the ones that were broken when he came down from the mountain and was greeted by this terrible scene of the people worshipping the golden calf and all the debauchery that surrounded that. And he literally threw them on the ground and they split. And here we see God rewriting the word, so giving the word of law again and inscribing it on a new set of tablets of stone. So it's early in the morning, and Moses is now up again on Mount Sinai, and as commanded, he's taken the 2 stone tablets that he's cut, first of all, with him. One would assume, of course, they're blank at this point, as he takes them up on the mountain again. Now, this portion of the chapter, the opening portion of the chapter, focuses on repairing, in a sense, the damage that is done in the past, literally rewriting the commandments again on new stone tablets. And these tablets are to be a tangible symbol of God's unique relationship with Israel, demonstrated through the guidance that He gives with the commandments and, of course, the law, showcasing, if he likes, His special connection with Him, His special plan to reveal His way of living with each other and in relationship with Him through the revealing of this law, the laws of God, to Moses. And then the next significant event in this chapter is the Lord revealing Himself to Moses. In verse 5 it mentions that the Lord proclaimed His name. This proclamation is understood to be, when it talks about someone using or revealing their name or knowing someone's name in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, it's understood as a revelation of character. And that character is thereby described for us in verses 6 and 7, where the name of the Lord is seen to represent His attributes and His qualities that are then listed for us and given for us. By studying and looking at this aspect of chapter 4, we can gain insights into the importance of fellowship with the Lord, the consequences of sin, and how That creates a separation, a gap, if you like, in our ability to relate to the Lord. But also then through this new beginning again, we see the renewal of the covenant. So the big picture here being revealed to us is it highlights the truth that sin breaks your fellowship, your relationship with the Lord. It doesn't destroy it and it doesn't break it permanently, but it certainly changes your ability to have an intimate relationship with Him. It's a valuable lesson to learn from this chapter. But also in the fact that it doesn't completely break that relationship completely, it should serve as a reminder of God's faithfulness even in the face of our failures. So this character, his name is revealed through his character, and this is where we hear him described in terms of his personhood and character. In 34 verse 6 and 7, it tells us this: the Lord is merciful and gracious, long-suffering, abounding in goodness and truth. He keeps mercy for thousands, forgiving the iniquity and transgressions of sins. He by no means clears the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So in this we have a total picture of what God is like. And that's why I think this is an important section. It's what makes this a significant chapter, because it shows us two things, two main aspects of God's character. Firstly, he's merciful and compassionate. He's gracious and he's slow to anger. He's kind, truthful, reliable, and he's merciful. He will forgive the people of their sins and transgressions. Now, it uses both those words there. And there is a difference. Transgression is a word that means people willfully rebelling against the statutes of the law, whilst a sin is the offence of missing the mark, the standard set by God. So one, in a sense, involves willful disobedience. The other is more an accurate representative of just the fallen human state that we live in. So the Lord is proclaimed in these verses. His character and his characteristics are all listed in these two verses. But notice how these words emphasize his nature, his fully rounded character. To truly appreciate the significance of these words, we need to go all the way back to chapter 32, where the people had committed this terrible sin of idolatry. And in the light of that sin, the Lord is revealed here as, yes, still being gracious and merciful in nature. So Moses here, by spending this intimate time of God, by getting to know his name and his character, we then see in this chapter, following this revelation of the character of God at a new and more intense level, he bows down, acknowledging him and praises him. The only fitting thing he could do, really. And he acknowledges that the people are stiff-necked, just as God said, but he again intercedes, asking for God's forgiveness and pardon, that he might be allowed to be the one who, in a sense, takes the acceptance, agrees the covenant, allowing the inheritance for the people. Many commentators and scholars point out that although the people have broken the covenant very clearly given to them by God, the one that they agreed to just a few chapters ago and said, we will do these things, yet here in his grace, the Lord again reestablishes that covenant with them. You see, by rewriting the Ten Commandments again on a new set of tablets of stone, God reaffirms his commitment to his people, and at the same time promising to never forsake them, to always be with them. And the majority of the rest of this chapter will focus on the renewal of that covenant, so it may be repetitive to what has happened before, but that's because God is renewing something before in a new and just as meaningful way. And so starting from verse 10 all the way through to verse 28, we see the renewal of that covenant. So like I say, while part of this chapter may seem repetitive to what has been said before, it is meant to serve as a reminder of God's previous instructions and his intention to renew the provisions of that covenant. Repetition is one of the ways the Old Testament uses to say that something is important. So in verse 10, he declares that he will renew the covenant before all the people and that he will perform marvelous miracles, things that have never been seen before. And he emphasizes that these people, his chosen people, will witness his work and his power, which will include extra details given here: driving out the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And he instructs the people to observe his commandments while warning them at the same time that they should not make a covenant with the inhabitants of any of the lands that they're in, warning them again that if they do that, it is likely that it will lead to their worshipping other gods, the very thing they've been told not to do previously. So they have been warned, and warned again here. He urges them that as they progress to destroy the altars, the sacred pillars, which, remember, in terms of the worship of Baal, were scenes of human sacrifice and child infanticide, to destroy these altars and sacred pillars and the wooden images, emphasizing that they should reject the old ritualistic ways of worship of these ancient people, and that they should simply worship no other God but him, as he is the one true God, the God of all creation, and yet he is also a jealous God when it comes to the love of his people and his nation. And in verses 15 and 16 further explain the danger of making covenants, coming into any relationships, including married relationships, which could be suggested, when they enter these new lands. If they compromise and make treaties with them and intermix with them, they will end up worshipping their God and engaging in sinful practices. The evidence there is that that's what they've been led to do in the past. So God is here urging them not to compromise with these pagan nations as they take the lands. This instruction aligns with the New Testament principle of not, as Christian believers, being unequally yoked with unbelievers. And that applies to various aspects of life, primarily, of course, marriage, but also, of course, in terms of getting into close, intimate relationship, in terms of businesses. You need to be sure as a Christian that if you are initiating and starting a business, you can have a completely wide range of aspect on who you employ, but who you go into partnership in is very important from a Christian point of view. And of course, he specifically mentions in this list of prohibitions that he mentions the fact that they shouldn't make gods. He warns them against making gods for themselves or any representation of God for themselves. And he specifically, interestingly, mentions golden gods, which of course is a reference to this previous chapter and the previous act of creating the golden calf just back in chapter 32. And he emphasizes that and says no golden idol should be made. And additionally, God again instructs them to observe some feasts. The Feast of Unleavened Bread should be observed for 7 days, and he even tells them when that should be done. It should be done to celebrate that they came out of Egypt in the month of Abib, which is our modern day equivalent would be sort of March, April time. So yeah, you may feel you've heard this before, but that's because he's simply renewing and reminding them of all the stuff he told them to do before, and is saying, I want you to do this, enter into this covenant relationship with me, and don't compromise it by going after other gods or by mixing and taking on board other people's or other nations' worldviews or ways of worship or religious systems. And then in the rest of the passage of this middle part of the chapter, all the way down to verse 28, in fact, it repeats a lot of what has already been said in the establishing of the covenant, the Mosaic covenant with him. And that's why this section is actually entitled in my Bible, it may be in yours, the whole middle section, as it has a sort of a subheading which says the renewal of the covenant. So he's saying you broke it, but I'm still going to renew that blessing, that agreement with you, and your part of it is through by choosing to embrace these and live these precepts out as an act of willing obedience. So God, in a sense, is saying, look, I'm going to remind you of what you're supposed to do and not to do, and he just kind of ticks off one thing after another of what he's already said in the preceding chapters. It's even worth mentioning that things like in verse 20, he says that all that are open of the womb are mine, and that every male firstborn among you, your livestock, whether an ox or a sheep, So the Lord is reminding them, particularly through the metaphor, the image of the firstborn, that everything that comes out of the womb or out of the land actually belongs to him. This part of the Mosaic law said that the firstborn belongs to the Lord, whether it be human or animal. And it also establishes that through the voluntary, willingly sacrifice of the firstborn as a testimony to that fact. And we also see, of course, by the way, the Sabbath is re-established here, along with these feasts, the feasts of leavened bread, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of the Ingathering at the end of the year. All these feasts and provisions of the Mosaic law. In fact, there were 3 feasts mentioned here, statutes set up in the Mosaic legislation that required the people to come together to Jerusalem to observe them 3 times a year, and every man over a certain age would do that. And of course, remembering the regular event of observing this Sabbath. So he's kind of saying in all this, he says, look, I'm going to take care of your animals, I'm going to take care of the crops in the field, and I want you to observe these feasts and celebrations at regular times of the year as a testimony for you to keep remembering that I'm protecting you, I'm taking care of you, and you can trust me to do what I tell you I'm going to do, providing you live in fellowship, ongoing, regular fellowship with me. Now, if you've been tracking with me through the book of Exodus so far, you know that when Moses went up there for the first time, well, can you remember how many days he spent on the mountain? The first time when he received the law, that's right, 40 days. And I made a big issue out of the fact that it only took the people 40 days to fall into idolatry. So what this tells me is a warning, really, to all of us, that it doesn't take us very long to drift away from the Word if we neglect regularly bringing ourselves into the presence of the Lord. Moses was just up there for 40 days. And what's fascinating to me is while he was up there, we were actually told he does not eat bread nor drink water. In other words, the Lord has supplied his needs. A person cannot survive without food or water for 40 weeks. In fact, someone can't even survive without water for much more than 4 days, never mind 40 days. But according to this passage, Moses is up there for 40 days and 40 nights without eating or drinking. And the conclusion I would say to that is what happens up there is a miracle. But the purpose of that miracle and the purpose of that provision of the Lord to enable Moses to survive in that way is another picture, another way of telling the people, look, even by totally depending on me, I am always going to take care of you. And I think that the 40 days and 40 nights there up specifically mentioned as not having food or water is an illustration of that. So Moses would not only be able to come down with the law and tell them about it, would be able to say, look, the Lord can take care of us. He took care of me for 40 days and for 40 nights. Okay, that's what's happened so far in this chapter. The passage started out with a retelling of the rewriting of the law on tablets of stones. And then the second thing that happened is God reveals himself to Moses, renews all the stipulations of the covenant. And now the last thing that happens is this passage is Moses comes down and he reassures the people. So he returns to the people and says, look, folks, the Lord is not going to desert us. So within the context of the preceding chapters and what's gone on, he's saying, yeah, they've sinned against the Lord to the point where the Lord separated himself from the people and moved the tabernacle, the tent outside the camp. The Lord is meeting with Moses outside the area where the people are, but they need to be reminded that God has still not rejected them. And that's what is recorded all the way up to verse 35. But there is this strange verse which describes Moses coming down from the mountain again, having had this fresh revelation with these 2 tablets in his hand. And it says that as he comes down from the mountain, the skin of his face was shining while he talked with them. Now, various ways of describing this and various words are used depending on which version of the Bible you read. What we have here is a description of the face of Moses after he's been in the presence of the Lord and the glory of the Lord has been revealed to him in a new, deeper way, to the point that it causes his face to shine. So what happens is when Aaron and all the other children of Israel, they see Moses and they see his face shine, they're so overwhelmed by it, they're afraid to come near him. So Moses puts a veil on his face so that whenever the children of Israel see Moses in amongst them, that from this point on he would have a veil on his face when he went to speak to them. Now there are several interesting things about this. In fact, in 2 Corinthians, Paul explains for us and adds the detail that this glory, this shining face of Moses, would subsequently fade over the 40 years that followed as they wandered in the wilderness. But at this point, Moses has to put a veil over his face because the glory was at its most powerful at this point. It hadn't faded away. And Paul uses the fading, actually, now to think about it, of Moses' face over those 40 years, probably as a metaphor for the whole fact that the Mosaic legislation was fading away to the point that it would become that we were no longer under the law of Moses, that we had come under the law of grace in Christ Jesus. So it's a rather unusual, interesting little passage at the close of this chapter. But in the context of the whole chapter, what we see going on here is, in its totality, is just simply God renewing his covenant and Moses returning down and reassuring the people that they still come under the special relationship, so to speak, the covenant that he's made with them. They haven't completely broken or destroyed their relationship with the Lord. The Lord, in his grace, has decided to restore it. So even after the idolatry with the golden calf and all that surrounded that, the Lord rewrites the 10 Commandments, reveals himself anew to Moses and to the people, renews the covenant and reassures the people by having Moses communicate that renewal of the covenant to them. So that's the chapter. So what can we get out of this today in 2023? Well, maybe the big thing is the fact that the Lord is gracious and that he forgives sin. Every sin, even when it's the most diabolical of sin. So it is indeed a comforting chapter in that respect. What it tells me is that the Lord will forgive us, even if we go dramatically wrong. The continuing willingness of God to renew his promises is one of the central messages of the Bible. Despite the repeated sinfulness of the people, God is still seen to be merciful. He still forgives anyone who repents. And I think that's what this chapter is really about. That, I think, is the overriding message of this chapter. But I think there is also a second important sort of extra revelation of the Lord contained, almost hidden within the middle of the chapter, where it gives us this extra, added, additional, wider insight of what God is really like. 7 characteristics of God are revealed in this passage, and I want to finish by very quickly listing them for you. I think with them you really have a summary of the character of God. Now, I think the overarching principle of what God is like you can put down to 2 statements, one in a sense revealed and from the Old Testament and one from the New. In Leviticus chapter 11:44, it encompasses the whole fact when it simply says God is holy. And then in the New Testament, we have that overarching principle mentioned many times in the New Testament. One example would be John 4:1-16, where it talks about God simply being love. God is love. And those 2 things really sum up what God is like. But here in Exodus chapter 34 are 7 words that unpack, if you like, those 2 main principles. Where it says, crossing 6 and 7, it says, the Lord, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and the transgressions of sins. So, holy things, like the idea of God as holy, is illustrated by the principle of his justice and his righteousness, and then related to the love aspect are all those other things like merciful, compassionate, full of grace, patience, full of goodness, all those things. Now, I'm only giving you the tip of the iceberg with this. This is only the beginning. I think it's important to understand that this chapter 4 gives us a launching off point by revealing to us for the first time, really, these main 7 characteristics of God. They're actually given in 3 pairs, 6 altogether, that refer to his mercy, and then one single verse at the end referring to his justice. So clearly the message here, even in the Old Testament, is that mercy predominates. Love is the most important. He does that by emphasizing mercy in this list of characteristics, those loving aspects within this list of characteristics. And that would tell me that in the overall context of God's plan, his redemption plan of dealing with sin, mercy will always take precedence over the intervention of God in justice. And I think that tells us that we should always, wherever possible, to allow mercy to take precedence in our response to dealing with other people. The psalmist writes and said, "For your mercy is great above the heavens, and your truth reaches to the clouds." Or perhaps the best illustration of this is found in the book of Romans in chapter 3, where Paul writes and says this: "We are justified freely by his grace to the redemption that in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth to be a propitiation by his blood through faith, to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God has passed over those sins which were previously committed, that demonstrate at times past his righteousness, that he might be the just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Christ Jesus." And that's chapter 3 of Romans, and in chapter 5 he will go on to say, "God commended his love towards us, in that whilst we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." So love took precedence over justice. But of course the ultimate illustration of God's justice and mercy combined is the response of God seen on the dealing with the consequences of sin at the cross. The fact that the death of Christ satisfied the justice of God, that sin was paid for by that death, the wages of sin being death, and yet at the same time it was the greatest demonstration of love. So there again, it's love and justice, but love taking precedent over justice. How about Micah 6 verse 8 from the Old Testament again? "He has shown to you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to love him, and to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And Matthew himself said the Pharisees neglected the weightier matters for the law. So they neglected what Christ himself declared as the more important, describing them as the weighty matters of things like love and mercy, and instead they wholly focused, some might say, on just the justice and judgment of God. In fact, Paul again in Ephesians 4 says, "Speak the truth in love." There it is again. And in 1 Timothy, Paul talks about, "But you, O man of God, flee from those things and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and gentleness." There again, it is all about pursuing righteousness and love. That's what take precedence. And in 2 Timothy 2:22, it says, "Flee also youthful lusts, pursue righteousness, live in faith, love, peace, and those who call on the Lord should have a pure heart." Again, love and righteousness over and above justice and judgment. But when Paul sums it up, when all these New Testament, Old Testament writers sum it up, they always mention these two basic elements. But in the end, love takes precedence. So the Lord is holy and loving. So say Micah, so say Paul, and so say the psalmists, and so does Jesus say. They all agree. And we too ought to do so by reflecting him in our lives, by being just, righteous, truthful, merciful, gracious, and loving. My friends, Exodus 34 exists, I believe, ultimately to show us who God is and what the Lord is like. But also by nature, then we should be able to see a model for what we ought to be like. Love and justice, gracious and merciful at the same time. We should live our lives mimicking him, disciples of him. That's what it means, students, followers of him. You see, it seems to me that sometimes some Christians just get stuck on being right and they get rigid. And then on the other hand, some Christians get stuck on just being loving and they forget about the righteousness and the justice of God. But what it tells me here, that both these additional characteristics need to be there to represent the authentic God of the Bible. But they both need to be there, but we need to get the balance right, and the balance should always be weighted in favour of love. So we need to be both of them both of these aspects at the same time, but always weighted towards love and grace. And how do we do that? How do we live that way? And the answer is, we just need to be wise, and we need to have wisdom, heavenly wisdom, biblically wisdom. And that's what this book we call the Bible is all about. It is a manual that allows you to know how to pour the love of God and the truth of God into you, and then thereby to have it sealed by the power and the revealed wisdom of the Holy Spirit. Put it very simply, righteousness is doing what is right and what is loving. And as believers, as we get more and more exposed to the Lord Jesus Christ and his life and his righteousness, the more and more we have an ability to recognize what is right and what is wrong, and the desire to do what is right will grow. Loving is always doing what is best for the other person. It's seeking the highest good. And as believers in the Lord, the more and more we are exposed to the life, the ministry, the love and the truth of the Lord, the more and more there will be a desire to do what is right and loving. The most detailed description of love in the Bible is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I don't have time to read it for you today, I did plan to, but go and take a look at it. It unpacks in great detail all the characteristics of what love is and what love does for us. And within that passage, the two outstanding positive characteristics are revealed in terms of love are patience and kindness. You see, when righteousness is displayed without love, it just means we become judgmental. And love without righteousness just becomes sentimentality. Christ-likeness, on the other hand, is about being loving and righteous at one and the same time, and in the right proportions. The two things are never in conflict with each other when they're bound together by the love of God revealed through the life and ministry and teaching of Jesus Christ. Because what is right is loving, and what is loving is always true.